Here we are at the end of this third week of lessons, and have made some progress in some early material, Islam and the Jews, and now somehow the Jews and Islam. Um, and I'm really excited about the course so far. I'm excited about your responses, the depth of your responses, the insights that you've shown in the various things that we've been reading, and I'm very confident and optimistic that will continue as the semester goes forward. So I just want to say a few things about the issues that we talked about during this last week. Just about all of you, I think, have submitted at this point, and have submitted very interesting and responsive comments. Um, and as I say, some of you have done yeoman's work and really going back and responding to my responses and responding to other people. That's what makes this kind of online course, as far as I'm concerned, a joy to participate in and a joy to teach. So let's talk a little bit about the initial material, the first three or four questions on Jewish life under Islam, and then we'll spend a few minutes talking about the story of Halbertal and the question of people of the book, text-centeredness, and so on. We'll do a lot more of that this coming week. The question of Jewish life under Islam has been somewhat controversial, as Cohen says, I think, at the beginning of the book on the history of Muslim Jewish relations throughout, and there have been those who have seen it as bad all the way through. There are those who have seen it as been good all the way through to the Jews. And like Cohen, there are those who would say there are good times and bad times. For the most part, Cohen will say that in the early period, let's say 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, the situation was not bad. It began to get worse later on. Maimonides had to run from Spain, went to Egypt, but he was still living under Muslim leaders there as well. And the story of what it means to live as a dhimmi, we talked about last week a bit, and the issues related to that are also quite interesting. It's not so easy to understand how you have all these rules, the Pact of Umar and others, and the Jews seem to be doing okay with that, even though they're there as second-class citizens. As I think I noted, and others have as well, the fact that the Jews were not the only second-class citizens, and the fact that they were second as opposed to third class, meant something. That is, they were not the lowest level in the society. They were at least people of the book, and they could pay a tax and not be preached at to convert. They could have their own religion. They could have their own places where they prayed. There was all kinds of controls there over what they wore, over how that synagogue could be built, if any new ones could be built. A variety of things were trying to, in the Muslim world, were trying to make sure that they did not, overreach their bounds, that they didn't make it appear as if they were at the same level as the Muslims, as was the case with the rules with regard to Christians as well. But for the most part, as we see at least in the early days, they were able to survive pretty well, pretty much okay, and they were able to have their own institutions. They were not restricted economically. They adopted the Arabic language very quickly, and it became the lingua franca. It became their natural language. Later on, they began to write this language in Hebrew letters as well, and they just wrote about everything. They wrote just about everything in Hebrew except for poetry. They would not, in Arabic, they would not write poetry in Arabic. That was a kind of glorification of the language, and they didn't want to glorify Arabic, they wanted to glorify Hebrew, so they did their poetry was written in Hebrew. But much of the works, Maimonides wrote almost all of his stuff in Arabic. Judah Halevi wrote his philosophical stuff in Arabic, while his poetry wrote in Hebrew. and so on. Sadia Gaon, his book of beliefs and opinions, also was written. It was written in Arabic, and as you saw, for the most part, the development of Jews during this period was pretty good. They held positions of power within Islamic governments. Sometimes there was a problem if it became public that they had too much power, then that power had to be taken away. And as I mentioned in the postings, what happens there and what happens throughout Jewish history, and it already happened and continued to happen all through into modern times, is that when a society has developed a strategy for dealing with the Jews, and the Jews are comfortable in that strategy, which has happened in many places throughout the years, that only works when there's a stability within that world, when there's no warfare, when there's no sense of a challenge and fear and so on. When that stability disappears, then people retreat into their own worlds and they get scared of everybody else. And they want to use the other people as scapegoats. So when the situation got difficult, for example, in Spain during the Reconquista, when the Christians began to reconquer Spain and take it back over again from when they had lost it to the Muslims, the Jews were in a pretty tough spot there. That is, whose side should they be on? They wanted to be on the side of the winners and not the losers, and so both the Muslims and the Christians were suspicious about their loyalty, and they probably had good reason to be suspicious about their loyalty. There was no innate reason why they should prefer one over the other. Maybe things, again, were a little better under Islam. But I think that your overall sense about the way that this period was treated in the readings that we had, I think were pretty accurate. I think maybe I'll try to post for you, not in terms of a required reading, but something you might want to read, is a kind of different way of looking at this, which tries to show that the situation under Islam was not so great. And there was a big argument in the 90s between Mark Cohen and a man named Norman Stillman that was in Tikkun magazine, where Stillman accuses Mark Cohen of being too Pollyanna-ish about the time under Islam, and it's a wonderful time there, and so on. And then Mark Cohen responds back and challenges what Stillman said, both about him and about the facts at that time. One of the interesting questions that then arises is, so what does that mean? Is there any implications for today? The incredible antagonism that we find in the Muslim world seems to have been influenced a great deal by Christian anti-Semitism, which we'll be looking at in a couple of weeks. But what does that mean? Is there something about the attitudes to the Jews which were not so horrendous in the Quran and afterwards? They weren't loving necessarily, but is there something about that can be retrieved? There are those who would like to say that the negative attitudes to the Jews in Islam are not at its core, where it seems like in Christianity those negative attitudes towards the Jews are really at the core of Christianity, because if you have Judaism, then what do you need Christianity for? And you also have a narrative where the Jews are the ones who killed Christ, who killed one Savior. So it's an interesting question to think about, and I've been thinking about it over a number of years. I'm not sure if it's purely theoretical, because the building blocks of a pretty intense anti-Jewish attitude have developed pretty well over these last number of years. The things that were surprising to you, I like that question. I think I'll continue to ask that question. It's the first time I'm doing that this semester, because you raise lots of interesting things that I wouldn't necessarily have known would have been surprising to you. And the question of dress, the question of the kind of poetry that they were able to write, and other kinds of things like that, because it more or less brings you into the realia of what it meant to live in a Muslim society. We should not forget, however, that living as a second-class citizen was not a joy, was not fun, and you always had to be there as a viewed as somebody who is not as good as the other. In a certain sense, one might look at the status of the Jews under Islam as more like racism in our world and in our society. Let's say the situation of the blacks. And we'll talk about the difference then between what it was like in the Christian world, where it's not so much that you were a second-class citizen, but you were a threat. You were viewed as a threat to Christianity, as a threat to the world around you, and Jews needed to be gotten rid of within the Christian world. It reminds you a little bit more, let's say, of the kind of anti-Semitism that occurred in the Nazi era before, that kind of different form of racism. We'll get into that a little bit more, and I'm not sure if that parallel really holds, but it is one way to talk about it. And then just finally a few comments on the Halbertal beginning of his book, Text-Centeredness, and what is text-centeredness and how it works. You'll be reading this coming week the rest of that chapter and material also from James Kugel and his book, How to Read the Bible. The introductory material about the ways that Jews read the Bible and their assumptions when they entered into the reading of the Bible. And what does it mean to engage a text? And what does it mean, as you wrote about, a sealed text as opposed to an unsealed text? What he calls a charitable reading of a text as opposed to an uncharitable reading of a text. I've been using the term generous reading and ungenerous readings of the text. That really means sort of the same kind of thing. And it really deals with that whole question of what is a text in the first place. And we'll be looking at the question of pshat. What is the simple meaning of a text? And is there such a thing as an absolutely literal meaning, as simple as an absolutely unadorned meaning, or do we always have to bring meanings to it? There's a beautiful poem by somebody that you'll be looking at. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah, Wallace Stevens? Yes, it's called "On the Plain Sense of Things." And it opens up that question about pshat, the simple meaning of the text. And we'll be looking at the midrashic meaning, the homiletic meaning, and other kinds as well. In terms of the question I asked you, can one be too text-centered? And I think you had a wonderful series of responses to that question. And I'm not 100% sure how to deal with it. I think that I do have sometimes a feeling that some people in the Jewish community have such a need with everything they do to justify it by finding a text. And that's what happens. It's really finding a text that will already verify or confirm what you are claiming. And after a certain point, I say, well, just go ahead and claim it. And let's worry about finding the text, later. I was thinking when it came to women and Judaism, women's rights in Judaism, women being able to be counted for a minyan, a bunch of things like that, that there was a need to find texts which would justify it. And at a certain point, I was coming to my own conclusion that, look, if it's the right thing to do, we should do it. And we can find some text if we search hard enough. We can find some old traditions which did give women more rights than others. But that probably should be the first thing. There is something that needs to happen. We need to do it, and then maybe we'll look at the text afterwards. Now that's a dangerous thing to do as well, because it means that the rootedness of what you're doing is no longer communal. You've written about commonality. And about community and about community standards and so forth. So you don't want to just develop something brand new without any connection to the past, your past, the sense of the present, what's going on. On the other hand, if there's something that seems so right, and you can't find an appropriate text from the past to link it to make it connect to, I'm not sure what you should do then. It's been my view. Go ahead and do the moral thing. But again, it does come with some risks. So this coming week, we'll be reading, as I said, more of Halbertal. We'll be reading from James Kugel's book. We'll be looking at this Wallace Stevens poem. And you'll be reading commentaries. I'll be giving you some material from something called the Mikraot Gedolot, a traditional medieval Bible. This is now translated into English with the biblical text in the middle and the commentaries around the edges to give you a little bit of a sense of what that world looked like, the world of medieval interpretation. We'll spend a little bit of time looking at philosophical readings, mystical meanings as well. And then the following week we'll do a little more, we'll spend some time on the history of prayer and medieval Jewish philosophy, and then move in a transition towards looking at Jewish life under Christianity. So have a good week, and I'm going to be giving some information about office hours, probably not do them this coming week, but probably the following week.